June 4, 1942. Dawn. 180 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. The Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction, a mirror of blue broken only by the white wake trailing behind a single American aircraft carrier. The USS Enterprise cut through the swells, her flight deck crowded with dive bombers and fighters, their propellers still, their pilots not yet summoned to the ready rooms. In the spaces below, mechanics checked oil lines and ammunition feeds. In the galley, coffee brewed in massive urns, the smell cutting through the salt air that seeped into every compartment. On the bridge, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood silent, his eyes fixed on the horizon where intelligence reported the largest concentration of Japanese naval power ever assembled in one place for fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, an armada that had swept across the Pacific unopposed for 6 months, striking Pearl Harbor, conquering the Philippines, dominating every sea lane from Tokyo to the Indian Ocean, and now steaming toward Midway with the absolute confidence of an empire that had never known defeat at sea. Spruance knew the odds. He knew that in terms of raw numbers, firepower, and combat experience, the Japanese force was superior. He knew that many in Washington believed this battle would be a holding action at best, a delaying effort to buy time for the industrial machine back home to build the fleet that could eventually challenge Japan's dominance. He knew that the men under his command, most of them barely passed their 20th birthdays. Many who had never seen combat until months ago were about to face the most elite naval aviators in the world, pilots who had honed their skills over China and perfected their tactics at Pearl Harbor, pilots who flew with the precision of surgeons and the confidence of men who had never lost. But Spruance also knew something the Japanese did not. He knew where they were. He knew their course, their speed, their composition. He knew because American codebreakers, working in a basement in Hawaii with nothing but intercepted radio signals, a brilliance born of desperation, had cracked the Japanese naval code. The enemy's plans, their movements, their intentions, all of it laid bare through intelligence work that represented the quiet, unglamorous side of American ingenuity. And that knowledge, combined with the courage of men willing to fly outdated aircraft against overwhelming odds, was about to turn the tide of the Pacific War in a single morning. This is the story of that moment, not the sweeping strategic narrative told in history books, but the intimate, brutal reality of what happened when one carrier, supported by skill, sacrifice, and a tactical advantage that enemy never suspected, stood against the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy and shattered it so completely that Japan would never recover. This is the story of Midway, distilled to its essence, courage meeting preparation, desperation meeting opportunity, and a handful of American pilots who flew into hell and emerged as the men who saved the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire was at the height of its power. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered an area stretching from the central Pacific to the borders of India. From the Aleutian Islands to the shores of Australia, Hong Kong had fallen. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, had surrendered in humiliation. The Philippines were lost. American and Filipino defenders forced into the brutal death march at Bataan. The Dutch East Indies, with their precious oil reserves, were firmly in Japanese hands. The Royal Navy had been driven from Southeast Asian waters after the sinking of the Prince of Wales and repulse. Everywhere the rising sun flag advanced, Allied forces retreated or surrendered. The speed and totality of Japanese success shocked the world and confirmed what many in Tokyo had long believed, that the warrior spirit of Japan, combined with superior training and tactics, made them invincible in the Pacific. The instrument of this dominance was the WWII Air Fleet, built around 6 of the most modern, powerful aircraft carriers ever constructed. These were not merely ships. They were mobile airfields that could project devastating striking power across thousands of miles of ocean. Their pilots were the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy, men who had trained for years before the war, flying hundreds of hours in peacetime exercises that demanded perfection. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized aggressive, coordinated strikes delivered with split-second timing. Their torpedoes were the best in the world. The Type 91, modified for shallow water attacks, had devastated battleship row at Pearl Harbor. Their dive bombers were accurate and deadly. Their Zero fighters, nimble and long-ranged, dominated every sky they entered. and their carrier crews operated with a speed and efficiency that American observers watching pre-war footage had found almost unbelievable. But the WWII had a weakness, one that was not apparent in the string of victories that followed. Pearl Harbor, Japanese carriers, designed for offensive operations, carried relatively light armor and inadequate damage control systems. Their hangars were enclosed, which improved operational efficiency but created confined spaces where fires could spread rapidly. Their aviation fuel systems lacked proper ventilation and safety measures. These were calculated trade-offs, accepted by designers who believed that offense was the ultimate defense, that the best way to protect the carrier was to destroy the enemy before they could strike. This philosophy had worked brilliantly for 6 months. It was about to fail catastrophically. American intelligence had been tracking Japanese naval movements with increasing success since the beginning of the war. The U.S. Navy's codebreakers, led by Commander Joseph Rockford at Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, had made partial progress against the Japanese naval code known as JN-5. They could not read every message, but they could read enough, and in the spring of 1942, they began intercepting references to an operation against a target designated AF. Rockford believed AF was Midway, a small atoll that served as the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific. If Japan captured Midway, they would have a base within striking distance of Hawaii. More importantly, Japanese planners believed that an attack on Midway would force the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle. Japan was confident it would win, crushing American naval power and forcing a negotiated peace that would leave Japan's conquest secure. To confirm that AF meant Midway, Rockford devised a simple ruse. He had Midway's garrison send an uncoded radio message, REPO or TING, that their water distillation plant had broken down. Days later, Japanese intelligence transmitted a coded message stating that AF was short of fresh water. It was the confirmation Rockford needed. The Americans now knew not only the target but, through painstaking analysis of intercepts, the approximate timing and composition of the Japanese force. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, made a decision that would define his career. He would set a trap. The Japanese plan was complex, involving multiple forces attacking in sequence. A diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands in the North would, Japanese planners hoped, draw American carriers away from Midway, then the main force for fleet carriers to battleships. Numerous cruisers and destroyers would approach Midway from the northwest, launch a devastating airstrike to neutralize the island's defenses, and then land invasion forces. If American carriers responded, they would be destroyed by the superior Japanese fleet. It was a plan built on the assumption of Japanese superiority and American predictability, but Nimitz was not predictable. He ignored the Aleutian diversion, recognizing it for what it was. He ordered the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, hastily recalled from the South Pacific, to assemble northeast of Midway. He ordered the carrier Yorktown, damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea and expected to need months of repair, to be patched up and made operational in 72 hours of feet. That Pearl Harbor's shipyard workers accomplished through round-the-clock effort that bordered on the miraculous. 3 carriers against 4, outnumbered but forewarned. The Americans would have surprise. They would choose the moment to strike, and they would need every advantage, because what they were about to attempt had never been done before. A carrier battle fought, and won through intelligence, timing, and the willingness of pilots to press attacks against impossible odds. The night before the battle, the pilots gathered in the ready rooms aboard Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. They were young, most in their early 20s, some still teenagers. They came from farms in Iowa, factories in Michigan, suburbs in California. They had joined the Navy before the war, drawn by adventure or economic necessity or simply the chance to fly. Many had never imagined they would be here, about to face combat against an enemy whose skill and aggression had become legendary. In the 6 months since Pearl Harbor, their aircraft were adequate, but not exceptional. The Douglas SPD Dauntless dive bomber was rugged and reliable, but slow. The Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber was new and still plagued by teething problems. The Grumman F Wildcat fighter was outclassed by the Zero in almost every performance category. Except durability, the Americans did not have technological superiority. They had intelligence, determination, and leaders willing to take calculated risks. The briefings were matter of fact. The Japanese carriers were here, marked on charts with coordinates derived from reconnaissance flights and code intercepts. The strike would launch at dawn, time to catch the enemy while their aircraft were being refueled and rearmed after their initial attack on Midway. Timing was everything. If the Americans arrived early, they would face fully armed Japanese combat air patrols. Too late, and the Japanese would have launched another strike, this time against the American carriers. The window was narrow, measured in minutes. There would be no second chances. As the pilots tried to sleep in the hours before dawn, the carriers steamed through the darkness toward the launch point. On the bridge of the Enterprise, Admiral Spruance calculated distances, fuel loads, and timing with the precision of an engineer. He had been a cruiser commander, thrust into carrier command by circumstance, but he understood the mathematics of naval warfare. He knew that launching from maximum range would give his pilots barely enough fuel to reach the enemy, conduct their attacks, and return assuming everything went perfectly. And nothing in war went perfectly. He knew he was asking his men to fly to the edge of their operational limits. He knew some would not return, but he also knew that this was the moment that justified every risk. Because if the Japanese carriers were destroyed here, the entire strategic situation in the Pacific would shift. And if they were not destroyed, if they survived to hunt down and sink the American carriers, then the war would be lost for years, perhaps forever. After 30 on June 4th, the first aircraft began launching from Enterprise. The flight deck crews worked with practiced efficiency, spotting planes, checking control surfaces, hooking them to the catapult. One by one, the dive bombers roared down the deck and clawed into the pre-dawn sky, forming up in the darkness, their navigation lights winking as they circled and waited for the rest of the strike group. By 6 o'clock, over 100 American aircraft were airborne, flying northwest in loose formations, scanning the horizon for the enemy fleet that intelligence promised would be there. The Japanese, meanwhile, were conducting their own operations with the confidence of a force that had never been surprised, never been beaten. After 30, they had launched their first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, bombers and fighters, tasked with suppressing the island's defenses. The strike departed cleanly, and the carriers began the process of recovering their combat air. Patrol fighters, refueling them and preparing for a second wave. Below decks, ordnance crews worked to rearm aircraft, swapping bombs for torpedoes. Because the mission had shifted, initial reports from the Midway strike indicated that a second attack would be needed to fully neutralize the island. But then, at 7:28, everything changed. A Japanese scout plane, delayed in its launch due to a mechanical issue, radioed a stunning message. American ship sighted. The location was northeast of the Japanese fleet, close enough to be a threat. Minutes later, another message. The American force included at least one carrier. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the WWII, faced an impossible decision. His aircraft were being rearmed for a second strike on Midway. If an American carrier was nearby, he needed to attack it immediately before it could launch its own strike. But switching ordnance, removing bombs, bringing up torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from the magazines would take time during which his carriers would be vulnerable. He ordered the ordnance changed. On the hangar decks, crews frantically removed bombs and stacked them on the deck, intending to move them below once the new ordnance was loaded. It was textbook procedure. It was also a catastrophic mistake. At 9:20, the first American aircraft arrived over the Japanese fleet. They were TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the Hornet, 15 aircraft flying low and slow, struggling to reach attack positions against the nimble Japanese carriers that twisted and turned at high speed, leaving white wakes across the blue sea. The Japanese combat air patrol, over 50 Zeros circling above the fleet, fell on the Devastators like wolves. One by one, the American aircraft were shot down or fell into the sea, their torpedoes missing, their crews lost. Of the 15 aircraft, only one survived. It was a slaughter, and it seemed to confirm Japanese superiority. American torpedo attacks had failed repeatedly in the early months of the war. This was no different, but the sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese fighters, drawn down to low altitude to massacre the torpedo bombers, were out of position when the next American strike arrived. At 10:22, 3rd to 7 SPD dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, emerged from the clouds at 14,000 feet, directly above the Japanese carriers. Below them, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu maneuvered in formation. their decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, their hangar decks stacked with bombs removed from the aircraft moments before. The carriers were helpless, their fighters at low altitude, their attention focused on the torpedo bombers that had just been destroyed. They had perhaps 30 seconds of warning. It was not enough. McCluskey's dive bombers rolled into their attacks, plunging nearly vertical toward the carriers, wind screaming past their canopies. The enemy ships growing larger with terrifying speed. At 2,500 feet, they released. The 1,000-pound bombs fell away, arcing downward. On the Akagi, the flagship of the WWII, the first bomb struck near the midship elevator, penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the upper hangar. The blast ignited aviation fuel and set off the bombs stacked on the hangar deck. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. Fire spread with horrifying speed, consuming aircraft, fuel lines, ordnance. Within minutes, the Akagi was a floating inferno, her crew abandoning ship. The Kaga suffered the same fate, multiple bomb hits that turned her hangar into a crematorium. The Soryu, struck by 3 bombs in rapid succession, was torn apart by explosions so violent that debris was thrown hundreds of feet into the air. In 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, drifting out of control, their crews fighting fires that could not be extinguished. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch a counterattack. Her aircraft found the Yorktown and delivered devastating strikes. That left the American carrier dead in the water, but the Hiryu's triumph was brief. American dive bombers, hunting for the remaining Japanese carrier, found her in the afternoon and delivered the same destruction they had inflicted on her sisters. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers were sinking or had sunk. The WWII, the instrument of Japanese dominance, was destroyed, the cream of Japanese naval aviation pilots. Crews, mechanics went to the bottom with their ships. Japan would build more carriers, train more pilots, but it would never again possess the combination of skill, experience, and confidence that had made the WWII invincible. Midway was not just a tactical victory. It was a psychological and strategic turning point that shifted the momentum of the Pacific War irrevocably in favor of the United States. For the Japanese pilots and sailors who survived, the shock was total. They had believed themselves invincible. They had trained longer, fought harder, and won more decisively than any navy in history. And in 5 minutes, it had all been taken away by an enemy they had dismissed as inferior. The American pilots who delivered the killing blow were flying outdated aircraft. They lacked the experience of Japanese veterans. Their tactics were improvised, their coordination imperfect, and yet they had won, because they had arrived at the perfect moment when the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, and they had pressed their attacks with a courage that bordered on suicidal. The Japanese had no answer for that combination of intelligence, timing, and willingness to sacrifice. They had been out-hot and out-fought, and the realization shattered the confidence that had carried them through 6 months of conquest. For the Americans, the victory was validation. They had been bloodied at Pearl Harbor, humiliated in the Philippines, forced to retreat across the Pacific. They had watched the Japanese rampage across the ocean with what seemed like impunity. But at Midway, American intelligence, American leadership, and American courage had converged in a battle that proved the United States could not only fight the Japanese, but defeat them decisively. The victory did not come from superior technology or greater numbers. It came from preparation, from the unglamorous work of codebreakers and the willingness of pilots to fly into overwhelming enemy fire because the mission demanded it. It came from Admiral Nimitz's willingness to trust intelligence and take risks, and from Admiral Spruance's cold calculation of odds and timing. It came from the Navy's ability to repair the Yorktown in 3 days when it should have taken 3 months. It came, in short, from a combination of competence, determination, and adaptability that would define the American way of war for the rest of the conflict. The symbol of American resilience at Midway was not a weapon or a piece of technology. It was the SBD Dauntless Dive Bomber, an aircraft so ordinary that it seemed to embody the unglamorous pragmatism of American industry. The Dauntless was not fast. It was not heavily armed. It did not inspire awe the way the sleek Japanese Zero or the massive B-17 Flying Fortress did. It was a workhorse, built by Douglas Aircraft with the same focus on reliability and mass production that characterized American manufacturing. Its cockpit was cramped and uncomfortable. Its range was limited. But it was rugged, it was stable, and when a skilled pilot dove it nearly vertical toward a target, it delivered its bomb with devastating accuracy. At Midway, the Dauntless became the instrument of Japanese defeat. The bombs that struck the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were delivered by Dauntless dive bombers flown by pilots who had trained for months on the techniques of dive bombing: the steep dive, the precise release point, the violent pullout that grayed out vision and pushed the aircraft to the edge of structural failure. These were not glamorous missions. Dive bombing required flying into concentrated anti-aircraft fire, holding the dive until the last possible second, and then pulling out so hard that some pilots blacked out from the G-forces. It was physically and mentally exhausting, and the casualty rates were high, but when a Dauntless bomb hit, it destroyed whatever it struck. And at Midway, the Dauntless hit again and again, turning the pride of the Japanese fleet into burning wreckage in 5 minutes of precise, devastating violence. The Dauntless symbolized something larger than tactical effectiveness. It represented the American approach to war: practical, efficient, focused on results rather than aesthetics. Japanese aircraft were often beautiful, engineered with attention to performance and elegance. American aircraft were built to be produced by the thousands, maintained in the field, and flown by pilots with months of training rather than years. They were not perfect, but they were good enough, and when combined with intelligence, leadership, and courage, good enough became overwhelming. The Dauntless flew throughout the Pacific War, from Midway to the Philippines to Okinawa, sinking more Japanese shipping than any other aircraft. It was never famous. It never captured the public imagination the way the P-51 Mustang or the B-29 Superfortress did. But it won battles, and in war, that is all that matters. The aftermath of Midway reshaped the Pacific War. Japan had lost not only for fleet carriers, but the irreplaceable pilots and crews who had made the WWII the most feared naval force in the world. Japanese shipyards could build new carriers, and they did, but they could not replace the experience that had been lost. Pre-war Japanese pilot training programs had been long and rigorous, producing aviators of exceptional skill, but in small numbers. When those pilots were killed, their replacements were rushed through abbreviated training programs that emphasized survival over excellence. By 1944, American pilots routinely encountered Japanese aviators with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, young men thrown into combat with minimal preparation. The result was a massacre. Japanese naval aviation, once the elite of the Pacific, became a wasting asset, losing more pilots than it could train, until by the end of the war it resorted to kamikaze tactics, suicide attacks that traded aircraft and pilots for marginal damage against American ships. The United States, meanwhile, scaled up its training programs to produce pilots by the thousands. American flight schools operated around the clock, turning out aviators who received far more training than their Japanese counterparts. By mid-1943, a typical American naval aviator had over 300 hours of flight time before joining a combat squadron, compared to fewer than 100 for many Japanese pilots. The disparity in skill and experience compounded over time, creating a situation where American pilots dominated not because of superior aircraft, though by 1944, American technology had caught up, but because of superior training, tactics, and numbers. Midway had not only destroyed the WWII, it had forced Japan into a war of attrition it could not win. The strategic consequences were equally profound. Before Midway, Japan held the initiative in the Pacific. After Midway, it was permanently on the defensive. The planned invasion of Midway was abandoned. Plans to strike at Hawaii or cut the supply lines to Australia were shelved. Japanese forces in the Central and South Pacific found themselves isolated as American submarines, freed from defensive duties, began the campaign of commerce raiding that would eventually strangle Japan's economy. American carriers, no longer outnumbered, began offensive operations that culminated in the island-hopping campaign that brought the war to Japan's doorstep. Every subsequent battle in the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to the Marianas to Light Gulf, was fought in the shadow of Midway, a battle that proved the United States could match and defeat Japan's best forces in head-to-head combat. For the men who fought at Midway, the experience left scars that never fully healed. The pilots who survived told stories of comrades who did not return, of aircraft that vanished into the sea, of the horrifying sight of Japanese carriers burning so fiercely that the smoke could be seen for 50 miles, they remembered the exhaustion of flying combat missions that lasted hours, the terror of diving through flak so thick it seemed solid, the guilt of survival when so many others had died. Many carried these memories in silence for decades, unable to articulate what it had felt like to be 19 years old and responsible for decisions that determined whether nations won or lost. But they also carried pride. They had been part of something larger than themselves, a moment when courage and skill and a bit of luck had combined to change history. They had proven that the Japanese were not invincible, that American forces could stand and fight and win against the best the enemy could field. That knowledge sustained them through the long years of war that followed, through Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Iwo Jima, through the brutal island campaigns where victory was measured in yards and casualties in thousands. They knew, because they had been at Midway, that the United States would win. It might take years. It might cost hundreds of thousands of lives, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Decades after the battle, historians would debate the fine details of Midway, the timing of launches, the decisions made by commanders, the role of luck versus skill. Some would argue that Japanese mistakes, particularly the decision to rearm aircraft for a second strike on Midway, were as important as American actions. Others would emphasize the role of intelligence, claiming that Midway was won in the basement, in Hawaii, where codebreakers deciphered Japanese messages. Still others would focus on the courage of the torpedo bomber crews, whose sacrifice drew Japanese fighters out of position and made the dive bomber attacks possible. All of these perspectives contained truth. Midway was not a single moment of brilliance or a single act of heroism. It was a convergence of many factors: intelligence, leadership, training, courage, and yes, luck that combined to produce a result that seemed impossible on paper. But perhaps the most important factor was the willingness of American forces to adapt and learn. The early months of the Pacific War had been a catalog of failures: Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, Java Sea. American forces had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and humiliated. But instead of accepting defeat or clinging to failed doctrines, the Navy had analyzed its mistakes, incorporated lessons learned, and changed its tactics. Torpedo tactics were revised, fighter coordination improved, damage control procedures were updated, intelligence gathering was prioritized and resourced. Leaders who proved ineffective were replaced. The result was a fighting force that, by Midway, was not yet superior to the Japanese in all respects, but was competent, confident, and willing to take calculated risks. This ability to learn and adapt faster than the enemy would prove decisive throughout the war. While Japan clung to doctrines developed in the 1930s, the United States constantly refined its approach, incorporating new technologies, tactics, and strategies with a speed that bewildered enemy planners. American forces in 1945 bore little resemblance to those of 1941, not because they had been rebuilt from scratch, but because they had evolved through continuous learning and adaptation. Midway was the first clear demonstration of this capability, the moment when American forces proved they could not only match Japanese skill, but surpass it through preparation, intelligence, and the willingness to risk everything on a single, perfectly timed strike. The sun set over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, illuminating a sea littered with debris, oil slicks, and the scattered wreckage of what had been, that morning, the most powerful carrier force in the world. The fires on the Japanese carriers burned through the night, visible for miles, lighting the water with an orange glow that pilots described as both beautiful and terrible. Survivors clung to wreckage, waiting for rescue that would come for some and not for others. American ships, damaged but victorious, began the long journey back to Pearl Harbor, their crews exhausted, their aircraft depleted, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had won a victory that few had thought possible. In Tokyo, the news of the defeat was suppressed. The Japanese public would not learn the truth of what happened at Midway until after the war. Official statements claimed a great victory, reporting the sinking of American carriers and the success of Japanese operations. But within the Navy, the magnitude of the disaster was understood immediately. For carriers lost, the Kido Butai destroyed, the elite of Japanese naval aviation gone, the plans for further expansion shelved, the strategic initiative lost. Japan would continue to fight for 3 more years, would win tactical victories, would inflict terrible casualties on American forces, but it would never again possess the strength or confidence it had enjoyed before Midway. The Battle had broken. Something inside the Japanese war machine. A psychological fracture that would widen with every subsequent defeat until the empire collapsed in August 1945. For the United States, Midway was the moment when the war turned from defense to offense, from survival to victory. The carriers that fought at Midway would go on to fight across the Pacific, joined by dozens more as American shipyards produced vessels at a rate Japan could not match. The pilots who survived would train the next generation, passing down the lessons learned over the waters northwest of Midway. The intelligence analysts who had cracked the Japanese code would continue their work, providing commanders with the information needed to win battles. From the Solomon Islands to the Philippines, and the strategic confidence gained at Midway, the knowledge that American forces could stand against the best the enemy had and emerge victorious, would carry the United States through the darkest moments of the war that followed. There is a photograph, grainy and faded, taken from the Enterprise on the morning of June 4, 1942. It shows the flight deck crowded with aircraft, pilots climbing into cockpits, deck crews making final checks. The sun is just rising, casting long shadows across the deck. In the distance, beyond the railing, the Pacific stretches to the horizon, empty and peaceful. The men in the photograph do not yet know what the day will bring. They do not know that, in a few hours, some of them will be dead, their aircraft shattered by enemy fire or lost in the vast ocean. They do not know that others will become heroes, delivering strikes that will change the course of the war. They do not know that what they are about to do will be studied and remembered for decades, taught in military academies as an example of how intelligence, timing, and courage can overcome numerical disadvantage. They know only that they have a mission, that their country needs them, that they will fly into the unknown and do whatever is required, because that is what they signed up for, what they trained for, what duty demands. And in that simple, unremarkable moment, young men preparing to do a dangerous job, lies the essence of what made Midway possible, not grand strategy or technological superiority, but the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinary things when history calls. The Battle of Midway was not the most underrated war movie of all time. It was the most important naval battle of World War II, and it was won not by a single aircraft carrier against the entire Japanese fleet, but by 3 carriers, a handful of brilliant decisions, the work of anonymous codebreakers, and the courage of pilots who flew into death because the mission required it. The story deserves to be told not as myth or melodrama, but as what it was. A moment when preparation met opportunity, when intelligence guided courage, and when the United States proved that it could fight and win against an enemy that had seemed unbeatable. That lesson endures, not in monuments or movies, but in the knowledge that wars are won not by the side with the most ships or the best weapons, but by the side that learns fastest, adapts most effectively, and fights with a combination of competence and courage that cannot be overcome. Midway was the first proof of that truth in the Pacific War. It would not be the last.